Hello, I'm Liz, one of Derry's reference librarians, and welcome to another episode of Misinformation Busters. Once a week, we tackle a rumor or a false or misunderstood story, and we try to separate fact from fiction. And this week, we are talking about MSG, and I apologize in advance for mangling scientific terms. So, what's the story? Well, let's go back in time to about 1908 when a Japanese biochemist named Kikune Ikeda was trying to figure out what made the savory taste in his wife's seafood broth. He found that the glutamate, the ionic form of glutamic acid, was responsible and able to make a synthetic version. A sodium salt version of the glutamic acid, monosodium glutamate, or MSG, was born. And it's been a staple of Asian cuisine and, as we're probably all familiar with, Chinese restaurants in the United States and Europe. But it's also been associated with headaches and other ailments and even has a reputation of being unsafe. Have you ever heard of the phrase Chinese restaurant syndrome? That was born out of people blaming MSG for their ailments, and that is why you see Chinese restaurants advertising that they don't use MSG. But is MSG truly unsafe? So, what are the facts? Well, first off, Chinese food syndrome, kind of a not great term, and Merriam-Webster actually agreed, changing it to MSG symptom complex. But that term actually kind of relates to this because there's a lot of evidence that suggests that the way that MSG got its bad rap in the first place is a little bit rooted in racism and xenophobia. Truth is, 1, glutamic acid naturally occurs in a lot of foods, such as tomatoes, and 2, MSG was put in a lot of products in the 1950s and 60s, not just Chinese food. It was in snacks, baby food, and it was talked about in cookbooks as, quote, a mysterious white powder of the Orient. Then, people started worrying about chemical additives in their food, and MSG jumped to the top of the list. For a time, Chinese restaurant syndrome was considered a legitimate medical condition. And a lot of this has to do with conceptions of Asian cuisine. Ian Mosby, a food researcher, said that the U.S. has a long history of viewing food from Asia as dirty or dangerous. And since MSG was mostly known for its use in Chinese restaurants and cuisine, the reputation was set. Funny, because despite Japanese origins, we never really hear too many people complain about headaches after going to Japanese restaurants, despite it being used there. And this is where the science comes in. There's actually been no modern research that shows a definitive link between MSG and ill health effects. And a lot of what we really have is anecdotal. There were older studies done, but they had one big flaw. There's actually a good article in 538 that points out that the participants knew they had consumed MSG. There was no blind study, no control group, so someone went in having a bias. They might have been looking for after effects after consuming food with MSG, and that can skew the study. As for today, the FDA lists MSG as, quote, generally recognized as safe. It is required to be listed as an ingredient, but that goes for a lot of things. And when it talks about side effects, the FAQ page on MSG says this, quote, over the years, FDA has received reports of symptoms such as headache and nausea after eating foods containing MSG. However, we were never able to confirm that the MSG caused the reported effects. And goes on to explain that it's rare to consume the amount of MSG needed for bad side effects in a single meal. So is it possible that some people might have sensitivities and allergies? Absolutely, but that does not mean that a food or an additive is across the board unsafe, such as MSG has been reputed to be. There's actually been a backlash to MSG, with a lot of chefs defending it. The late Anthony Bourdain put it very bluntly, saying, quote, you know what causes Chinese restaurant syndrome? Racism. Oh, I have a headache. It must have been the Chinese guy. R.I.P. Anthony. But even with new research and a lot of vocal support from people in the food industry, the myth of MSG still persists. And if anything, this is a good lesson on how misinformation, especially if it's kind of fueled by prejudice, can stay in the culture. And it can be hard to change minds. But trying to dispel a myth is never a bad thing to do, especially if it means you can go eat some Chinese food and say, see, I'm fine. Thank you for watching, and as always, check for sources in the comments or feel free to research using our EBSCO databases, which are available through the library's website, or when in doubt, ask a librarian.